skeletal muscles and motor neurons operate along a complex electrical gradient rather than a simple switch. When an excitatory input enters the nervous system, an electrical signal travels down the nerve fiber, beginning a computation that hasn't reached its destination. This oscilloscope maps a neuron's baseline electrical state at -70 millivolts. To trigger action, the charge must reach -55 millivolts. Excitation accumulates in this 15 millivolt gap, depolarizing the membrane to perform computation without crossing into movement. This intermediate space is the computation zone. Here, the brain evaluates inputs and simulates possibilities while remaining in a state of physical rest. Relevance realization emerges directly from this subthreshold zone, where various neural representations compete for dominance until one gathers enough excitation to reach the firing threshold. This dynamic operates across vast, interconnected networks that are continuously shaped by the organism's physical surroundings. Environmental stimuli act as constant preactivators, raising the baseline excitation of specific neural pathways before an explicit task is even identified. In a forest, sensory inputs steadily excite nodes for trees, animals, and navigation, pushing them closer to firing thresholds. Simultaneously, representations for office or urban environments receive no excitation, leaving them at resting potential, far from activation. Neural activation follows the path of least resistance. Much like electrical current traveling through a partially ionized channel, activation flows toward the representations that are already partially excited by the environment. Salience is the result of this topography. What we perceive as relevant is simply the representation that requires the least additional excitation to reach its firing threshold. The brain processes complex inputs by breaking them into tokens, learned clusters of features, affordances, and expectations. In the primary visual cortex, V1, neurons detect basic geometric primitives, simple edges and boundaries. Moving to V2 and V3, these combine into contours and textures. Eventually, higher cortical areas produce a stable object representation, like a four-legged silhouette. Categorizing a visual silhouette requires progressive discrimination. The system must narrow down homologous features, ears, tails, fur, at the highest levels of the hierarchy before it can distinguish a dog from a wolf. Basic geometric symbols interact with this hierarchy differently because they are composed of the exact simple primitives detected at the first stage of processing. Because a symbol's structure is built from elemental lines and curves, it activates V1 detectors immediately. As that signal propagates upward, the symbol's structure remains recognizable to V2 and V3 without requiring the system to resolve complex textures or hidden features. This creates computational resonance. Every level of the visual hierarchy, from basic edge detection to high-level categorization, is recruited simultaneously by the same simple pattern. Symbols possess a psychological impact disproportionate to their visual complexity because they survive every level of tokenization intact, activating perceptual and emotional systems across the entire neural stack at once. The nervous system couples these visual representations with the body's potential for action. Visual information travels along two paths. The ventral stream identifies the object, while the dorsal stream maps its spatial relationship to the body. This allows the system to recognize affordances. A cliff is represented not just as a visual edge, but as a physical obstacle that requires a specific motor adjustment to avoid. Motor imagery studies show that thinking about an action recruits many of the same neural circuits used to perform it. Imagining sitting in a chair partially activates the motor pathways for the legs and core. These body-environment mappings contribute additional subthreshold excitation to the competing tokens, making certain interpretations more salient based on what the body can do. The system has evaluated the environment relative to the body's capabilities without committing to behavior. When sensory input is ambiguous, the system must resolve the competition between different token clusters. In this model, an ambiguous silhouette might partially excite several clusters. The DOG cluster currently sits at 70. New evidence, such as a growl or a flash of yellow eyes, enters as a fresh pulse of excitation. The network re-weights its clusters. The wolf cluster surges to 90%, and its dominance suppresses the dog representation. Expertise functions as a learned shift in this activation landscape. A specialist's prior experience ensures that specific, subtle features provide enough excitation to trigger the correct winning cluster far faster than in a novice. This conceptual model perfectly explains the uncanny valley. A wax statue provides enough features to excite the human token, but it fails to provide the expected excitation for movement and social interaction, leaving the system in a state of conflicting partial activations. These dynamics make salience personal without being arbitrary. Experience and biological predispositions physically dictate which neural pathways offer the least resistance to incoming signals. These subthreshold dynamics also govern how we reconstruct the past. Memory consists of the re-excitation of a neural topography rather than the retrieval of a static file. A memory is a distributed pattern across sensory, emotional, and motor nodes. When remembered, an excitation wave washes over this formation, reconstructing a past state. Neural oscillations regulate how this excitation cascades, increasing the probability that related tokens recruit together. This specific pattern of distributed excitation creates the subjective flavor of a memory, the feeling of nostalgia or familiarity that accompanies the facts of the event. Remembering is the physical reconstruction of a past subthreshold landscape, allowing the organism to re-experience the state associated with a previous environment. The chain of cognition is unbroken, from the detection of edges to the mapping of affordances and the weighting of competing tokens. This mechanistic sequence removes the need for a centralized homunculus, the idea of a tiny decider in the brain choosing what is important. This is the mechanistic pipeline of relevance realization. Sensory input triggers partial activations, which are refined by body mapping until a winner emerges as salient. Relevance corresponds to the topography of the activation landscape. The representation deemed most relevant is simply the one requiring the least additional excitation to achieve dominance. Through these dynamics, the constant stream of environmental noise is filtered and organized into a single focal point of attention. Human attention and relevance emerge as the physical consequence of organisms coupling with their environment through the path of least electrical resistance.